Sounds good. Great. All right. Hi, everybody. Jessica, do you have any announcements or anything that we need to do before we get started?
Nope, just
Okay.
tomorrow we have our next session at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Great. All right. Well, thanks all for coming today. It's been a while since I've done one of these. This is the second to last one that I will be leading, and the last one that's really about like research methods. The final talk I'll give next week is about publishing and sort of thinking about manuscript writing and that sort of thing. So we're going to talk today about qualitative analysis, but before I got started, I know that some of you maybe have done qualitative work in the past or are doing it right now for your STTP project. I remember reading the description. So I first wanted to ask just if anyone has any thoughts or experiences with qualitative analysis that they would like to share. There are no wrong answers. It's great. It's hard. It's terrible.
I guess one thing,
yes.
I've only done like quantitative research in the past, and so I feel like it leaves room for a lot of bias and interpretation, especially with coding. You could kind of pick and choose. So that was one thought we had today. And then, like I mentioned earlier, that coding can be very draining. And so it just takes a lot of time. But yeah, those are my thoughts.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about like ways that you can think about mitigating bias. And something I mentioned, I think when I gave the qualitative data collection lecture, was these checklists that exist for publishing, like the standards for publishing qualitative data. And so some of the things that I'll talk about today are also on those checklists, but they're another great place to look for ideas about kind of how to strengthen some of the validity of the way that you're both collecting and analyzing qualitative data. So I'll give a quick plug for that up front as well. But I do think that what you said at the outset, the sort of subjectivity of it, in some ways that's even a meta comment and a nice introduction for today, because a lot of what I'll be telling you, there's many different schools of thought about how you can do various things during the qualitative analysis process, from everything from how you set up your code book to how you undertake coding and how you undertake analysis. So I have my own biases, which I will try to put to the side, and I will present you with all options. But I'll try to sort of paint a picture of different ways that different people do some of these things. And over time, if you do more qualitative work, you will develop your own preferences and your own taste for this. And if you're working with a mentor right now, they may have ways that they like to do this as well. So there is, maybe I won't call it subjectivity, but I'll call it variation in how people implement various steps in the qualitative analysis process. And you'll sort of see that come up throughout the slides. Any other thoughts on experiences with qualitative analysis, good, bad, or otherwise?
Yeah, for me, this summer is the first time I'm also working with like qualitative data. Mm-hmm. And like we were talking about in the beginning, it takes so long. The first interviews we had were like 50-minute interviews, and they were taking me like 4 or 5 hours to get through and code as I was getting comfortable with the framework we were using as well. But I've discovered that it really builds upon itself. You don't start with the same code book. I mean, well, you start with one code book, but you really end with another. Mm-hmm. As you go through these interviews, you start to recognize themes you didn't see in the beginning, the more interviews you get through. So you add more codes and you start to see more common threads.
Yep. Yeah, perfect. Absolutely. So one really exciting thing about qualitative analysis, this is true for quantitative too, but I think it's maybe more apparent with qualitative, is how much it evolves as you're working on it. Sort of as you get deeper into the data, you hopefully had some research questions that your data collection was designed around, but as you kind of worked your way through analysis, you start to have new lenses for seeing codes and themes that maybe you didn't before. So I agree. I love that about qualitative analysis. I think it's part of what makes it really exciting. It is also part of what makes it really challenging and part of what makes it time consuming. So we'll touch on this, but as both of you have mentioned, just like the amount of time it takes to code, and in my opinion, it's not just the time, it's also just like the brain cognitive energy, like the attention that it takes and like the kind of focus. I think Tucker called it draining, which is a really good word. Like it's not only time consuming, but like it's exhausting. And I'll mention this a little later, but one of the perils of it getting exhausting is that as your brain gets tired, you start to take shortcuts. And so you'll notice if ever you try to do too much coding, like all in a row, you'll start like using the same codes over and over again. Like your brain will kind of fall into a habit because you're tired and you're cognitively tired. And so that's a reason to kind of break it up and take lots of breaks to kind of give your brain, get all those neural cobwebs out of there and kind of start fresh, and then you'll develop new patterns the next time and you'll have to erase those, but kind of not letting yourself fall into like the same repetitive thing, which is very easy to do. And it's like hard to detect when you're doing it, which is why building in breaks and just making sure you're not kind of doing too much coding back to back is super important. I don't know if Risa is available, but we're actually coding qualitative data right now for a project. Risa, would you like to share your impressions of working on qual analysis?
Yes, I mean, I have to admit, I was a novice. I've been involved in lots and lots of papers, but never coded data myself. And it has been quite the journey for me. But we creating the code book was incredibly challenging and time consuming, and my brain was having a lot of painfulness over processing. But now that we're actually coding, I really actually love it. I find it very enjoyable, and I really feel like I'm getting to know the data in a way that is so important and different than how I would normally do this, which would just be, reviewing other people's analyses. My biggest challenge is finding time in the day. So it's often nights and weekends. But I actually am really glad that at my ripe old age, I could take on a new skill, and Corinne has been very patient with me. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad you're enjoying it. That's good to hear because it is a lot of work. So totally. All right. So we'll get into it. I actually don't have that many slides today, partly because the material is kind of dense. So if you have questions, and there aren't that many of you, if you use the raise hand, it'll kind of reshuffle the videos, and I'll try to pause periodically as well to see if anyone has any questions or needs clarification. So today the objectives are, you should be able to describe different types of qualitative analysis methods by the time you walk away today, primarily deductive approaches. I don't use so much inductive, and don't worry, we'll do a quick refresher of what that is before we start. And sorry, this second objective should have gone away. In an earlier version of this lecture, it was longer and we would have time to work on practicing developing and applying a code book. Instead, I'm just going to show you some examples, and so you'll kind of see how code books look and how they're applied. So refresher, since it's been quite a while since we talked about this. So just what is qualitative research? So reminder, qualitative data typically are words, although it could be other things like images, but we're just going to do words today. And the research questions that you're typically trying to address with qualitative data generally have to do with like how, why, and what. We're not so much interested in how many or how much. So really the point of qualitative data and of qualitative analysis is to get it meaning, not frequency, but meaning. However, I want to underscore that that doesn't mean that qualitative analysis is just descriptive. So qualitative analysis, even though it's trying to get it meaning, can be comparative and can be analytic. It isn't always, but they certainly can be. And so I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that, qualitative data is just sort of, I think the analogy I've used in the past is like pinning butterflies on a wall. Like that's not, it's not like, oh, here's this nice anecdote, I'm just going to put it out there for you. Qualitative analysis should be some analysis. It should be doing comparisons and sort of taking an analytic approach, not merely just putting anecdotes out descriptively. And then there's something called mixed methods research, which brings in both qualitative and quantitative data. I talked about different types of mixed methods designs when we did the earlier qual lectures. So it could be side by side, qual and quant, or there could be some kind of integrated or iterative approach to using the two types of methods. And again, something I think I said last time, I don't want you to think of qual and quant as in opposition to one another, but you should think of them as complementary tools in your toolkit that are well equipped to answer different types of questions. So sometimes qual is more appropriate, sometimes quant is more appropriate, sometimes mixed methods works. So think of them really as different options available to you for different types of inquiry. Hopefully this picture looks familiar way back in your brain somewhere, but the distinction between inductive and deductive reasoning, and qualitative research can follow similarly an inductive or a deductive approach. So the kind of principle of deductive or inductive reasoning is that you can either start with a theory, something that already exists, a theory that's out there, a framework that's out there. From that theory, you develop a hypothesis, you collect data. That's considered a deductive approach to your research. And I usually think of this as it's going down from the theory to the data. Alternatively, you can collect data and from those data, make observations and infer upwards to a theory. So you can let the data be what you start with. You have no sort of a priori theories or hypotheses. You're starting like blank slate brain, looking at the data and saying, okay, I see these things look similar. You know, I sort of see these other things that look similar. And based on this, I'm going to generate hypotheses and ultimately work my way towards some kind of a framework and theory. And that's inductive research. So it's going up on the other side of the circle. So sometimes people will talk about grounded theory, qualitative research. If you've ever heard that word, a lot of ethnographic qualitative research, all of that is inductive. So it's generally not starting with a predefined theory. It's starting from really just letting the data speak for itself. 99.9% of what I do is on the right-hand side here. I primarily do deductive qualitative research. The field of my work, of sort of health services work, health policy work, we have a lot of theories. We're not quiet theory makers. So there's plenty of theories that I can tap to explain people's health-seeking behaviors, to explain access to healthcare, to explain utilization phenomena. So, you know, there's a lot of theories that I can work with. So I generally find that on the right-hand side, I'm well equipped to undertake deductive research. If there were something that like was brand new, we didn't have very much to explain, if I was really like agnostic about what theory might be best, then maybe I would undertake inductive, but I basically only do deductive. And so that's primarily what we'll be talking about today. So essentially from here onwards, assume that there is like an underlying framework or theory that you use to design your study that informed the hypothesis that you generated. It informed your interview tools. It shaped the direction that your research is headed. Okay, any questions about the refresher? Anything else you want me to sort of review before we get into just talking about analysis? Okay, so I'm primarily in my head as I'm giving this lecture, I'm thinking of interview data, but other types of qualitative data are similarly analyzed. So if you have focus group data or you have open-ended survey responses, they're all basically analyzed the same way. There's little wrinkles of difference here and there, but the general steps are the same. But I'm assuming that most of the data you will ever collect and ever analyze will be from one-on-one interviews. So that's sort of my prior going into this lecture. So the kind of very first step, kind of even before you get into analysis, is just data management. So hopefully when you conducted your interviews or your focus groups or whatever, you audio recorded with consent of the respondent. And so what you're walking away from your data collection with is an audio recording, either digital or on tape or whatever. If not, then you're working off of notes, and you treat those like a transcript, although doing exact quotes is a little bit harder. So best case scenario is you have audio recordings, of the interview that you conducted. So those audio recordings go to a transcriptionist, and that transcriptionist sits and makes a like verbatim document, like a Word document, that's the transcript of everything that happened during that interview. There's different types of transcription and different levels of detail, which we can talk about. But so during this data management stage, you move from having just audio recordings to having a written document of the contents of the interview or of the focus group. Since we're all global health researchers here, there is a reasonably high chance that at some point in your career, you'll have non-English language interviews. So I do most of my qualitative work not in the US, and so those interviews occur in another language. If that happened, then, and if you do not speak that language fluently, then you're gonna want those transcripts translated into English. That can be a two-step process. So someone transcribes, someone else translates, or it can be a combined one-step process if you have fully bilingual transcriptionists. So that's like best case scenario. So at the end of this, what you'll have is you'll have an audio recording, like a digital, MP4 file or whatever, a Word document in English of the contents of the interview, and maybe a Word document in the original language of the data collection, if it was a two-step translation. So now that you have these transcripts, your next step is you work on coding. So coding, if you haven't done it yet, is a process whereby you label the text in those transcripts by concepts or by themes. And I'm going to try to keep themes as a separate idea for later. So let's think of these as concepts. Often we use software for coding, and I'll show you what that looks like. I have been doing qualitative work long enough that I predate software. So I used to do this manually, but software has been a lifesaver for qualitative analysis. So usually we use software for linking codes to text or linking text to codes. The process of sort of coding requires a code book. And a code book, I'll show you examples, is either something that you define upfront. So certainly if you did deductive qualitative research, like you started with a theoretical framework, then that gives you a great launching point for your code book, because the constructs and the domains from that theoretical framework are like a natural starting place for your code book. So this is usually what happens for me because I do mostly deductive work. If you're working inductively, like letting the data speak for itself, then you may not have very many codes up front. In that case, you start reading the transcripts and you create what are called emergent codes because they're emerging from the data. So if you're doing inductive work, then basically your whole code book will be emergent codes. If you're doing deductive work, you might supplement that draft code book that was based on the theoretical framework. You might supplement that with emergent codes. So you may have had some survey questions that were like, were not informed by the framework, asked about something else. There might be new concepts that came up in these interviews that your original framework didn't account for very well. So there's lots of reasons why emergent codes might come up. Coding can be done by one person or more than one person, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. I would recommend double coding at least a subset, so having more than one person work on coding at least for some of your interviews for quality assurance. This is one way we mentioned earlier, kind of ways to reduce bias. This is certainly one way that you can help protect against it, is having more than one set of eyeballs working, both developing the code book and then applying it to the data. And then after you're done coding, the final step is analysis, which we'll talk more about. So analysis can be descriptive or can look for associations. So between codes or themes by respondent type. And I'll show you some examples and we'll sort of talk about that in a little bit. So these are the kind of overall steps of qualitative analysis. There's a data management phase, a coding phase, and then an analysis phase. This is a nice visual that sort of shows how this goes. So this isn't the management part, but this is like once you have the transcript. So step one, I love that they call it data immersion. So step one is really like reading some or all of your transcripts and like really understanding what's in your data. because you may not have conducted the interviews, you might have conducted only some, it might have been a while ago, you don't remember. So this sort of reading of the transcripts, becoming familiar or re-familiar with the data is a really important sort of step, especially if you're doing inductive analysis. So after you've kind of reviewed the data and you know where you're at, step 2 is coding. So here I can't entirely tell whether they're presuming, I guess, because they have theory at the bottom underlying everything. So I guess this is thinking about deductive work. So they're saying sort of based on the theory, you write codes and you work on coding. So you have these codes and you see there's these steps back and forward. So you apply the codes to the data. As you review the data, you might add more codes. You're kind of bouncing between steps 1 and 2. Then you might create categories of codes. So you may have codes like time waiting, time delays, time for adjustment, whatever. And you might over time realize like, oh, you know, these kind of hang together. These are getting at something bigger than any one of the codes, and I'm going to group them. And so in some of the code books I show you, you'll have what are sometimes called parent and child codes. So these are what these categories are, these sort of clustering of codes that conceptually hang together. And then during analysis, you'll identify themes. And so themes look across codes and across categories. And so I'm going to give you my like very coarse analogy for this, which may work for you or may not. So imagine a friend had you over to like help clean out their closet. They like wanted to donate a whole bunch of clothing and like, I don't know, remake their image or whatever. So first thing, like you would dump everything from their closet, like onto their bed, right? So that's sort of like the data immersion moment. You're like, okay, what do we have here? Well, like what's going on? Then you might start making little piles. So like, okay, these are like short skirts, those go together. Okay, then these are like longer skirts, these go together. And these are short sleeve blouses, these go together. These are long sleeve blouses, these go together, right? So you're going to sort of start making these little piles. That's like coding. Over time, you might be like, okay, long skirts and short skirts go together, blouses go together. So you might sort of keep the little piles, but you might put them like on the same part of the floor as you're putting everything together. And you're going to do that over and over again. And then identifying themes is like, you know, like looking at your skirts and your dresses and your shirts, like just sort of looking across these codes, like your style is sort of preppy, or like your style is kind of like boho or whatever. Like it's not about the short skirts. It's looking across everything and picking up something that touches across all of the different categories. So I would think of this stage, oh good, yay, thanks Tracy. So this stage is like, you know, you're learning from the individual codes. Not every short skirt might fit into that theme. And there might be entire codes that don't fit into that theme at all, but it's sort of a way of stepping back and connecting dots between all these different sort of types of codes, or in this case, piles of clothing. Yeah, I guess preppy is really not like a West Coast phenomenon. All right, so hopefully you have that analogy in your head, or this diagram works for you for kind of thinking about the process of coding categories and themes. So here's an example of a code book. This is actually a code book that I've used a few times, using it right now on the project that Risa mentioned. This is the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, the CFIR. And this is a snapshot of what their code book looks like. This code book goes on for like pages and pages and pages and pages and pages. This is just one little bit of it. The link at the bottom here is a website you can go to if you sort of want to see what the whole thing looks like, or if you think this might be a useful framework for your own research. But this gives you an idea of what a code book looks like. So once you start having ideas from codes, whether it's based on the theory or kind of emerging from the data, you start to write them out. And your codes can be hierarchical. I mentioned parent and child codes, or the structure can be flat. So here I'm showing you, so there are these codes like innovation source, evidence strength and quality, and they've been grouped into this category. There's more of them, have been grouped into this category of innovation characteristics. In other parts of this code book, there are actually parent and child codes. So like there's a parent code called implementation climate. And then there's child codes within that are like specific things about the implementation climate. So one is like available resources and one is like leadership engagement. So you can either have a flat structure or a hierarchical structure, depending on what kind of makes sense and works for your code book and your data. And just one other thing, so as you're developing your code book, it's not like just the list. So you see here, it's not just what's like on that left-hand column, but it's also the definition of that code is really important. So you need to spell out what that code is about, what it means. If you're being like very thorough, you'll have inclusion and exclusion criteria, and this becomes really helpful if there, and if you've done any coding, you can imagine why this is helpful. Like if there's concepts that kind of could go in one place under some circumstances, but if someone talks about it a different way, it actually goes in a different place. So really working as a team to specify and write down, like when this concept comes up in this way, it's this thing, and we're gonna document that. But if it comes up in this other way, so you see here, like, you know, exclude or double code statements related to who participated in the decision-making process, because that goes in engaging. So sort of separating out what goes where and really documenting it. And then some people have another column where there are some example quotes, sort of just to reinforce the inclusion criteria for that code. So at minimum, your code book should have like the name of the code and the definition. And then if you want to be really thorough, also what goes in and what goes out of each code. So you're going to draft this code book out. It's going to be based on theory, or it's going to be, you know, based on the data, whatever it looks like. And usually the first step with that draft code book is you do a test run. So you have a draft, and like usually 2, sometimes 3 members of the team will try to implement the code book on a subset of interviews. Like let's say you did 30 interviews, you might test run the code book on like 3 of those 30. And the point here isn't to code the data. You're not trying to get coding done. What you're trying to do is make sure that the code book can be applied to the data you actually collected. So it's like, do these codes work? What's missing? What's defined too narrowly? What's defined too broadly? Where's the gray area? So it's really like, it's truly a test run. All the coding you do during this step, you throw out later, because this code book is now going to change based on this process of the test run. So you have a draft, you do a test run, you identify challenges, and then you revise and you refine the code book. And kind of depending on how the test run went, you might do this once, you might do this twice, you probably won't do it like 3 times, but you might do it a couple times. And, you know, it's really to like work out the kinks on the code book, make sure everyone is clear on what these codes mean and how they apply to the data that you're working with. And I should say, in this stage, when you're doing the test run, you probably want to pick, you don't want to try it on like really short interviews. So you want like reasonably meaty interviews. So if someone was like very cursory, gave short answers, they're probably not a good candidate for the test run. And if you have like diversity in respondents, like let's say you had some men and some women, or you had some English speaking and some Spanish speaking, or, you know, you had some like important variation in who responded, you might want to deliberately kind of pick the transcript so that you're sure that the code book is applicable for the variety of transcripts that you have. You know, obviously every respondent is unique and you can't generalize, but you do want to be sure that if there's like big categories, that you're kind of trying out the code book with those big categories of respondents. So you've done the test run, you've updated the code book, you've updated the definitions, you've kind of, you know, refined and worked a little bit more. So now you have a solid draft. I'm still saying draft because it still might change. So, but this is like an advanced draft. This is like the penultimate version of the code book. Once you have that, at least one team member should apply that to a subset of the transcripts. So again, like if you have 30, you might want to try this with like 3 to 5 of this like more serious test run. So now this person or these people are actually coding. So before you weren't like really coding, you were like trying it, but this is like coding for real. If it's more than one person who's done this, which it should be, what you do afterwards is you sit down and you compare how you both applied the codes. So you both worked off the same code book and you worked on the same transcript. You want to make sure that you coded things the same way. That's important. That's a way to minimize bias during coding. So some people actually calculate a statistic for this, for inter-rater reliability, like to what extent do the raters, you know, are they reliable between one another? But even if you don't calculate the actual statistic, you do want to look and make sure that you're applying codes consistently. It doesn't need to be perfect. You don't need like 100% agreement. You know, you may have some differences of opinion, but like you want it to be pretty good. You don't want big differences in, I think this is this concept and someone else thinks that's something else. So you want pretty good inter-rater reliability before you move forward. If you get to this point, you do this and the two coders like disagree, or three coders or however many, if they disagree, then you rewind a step and you say, okay, we need to revise the code book. This is not the solid draft we thought it was. It's an earlier draft. Let's call this a test run. Let's see what needs to be fixed. Let's try this again. So you kind of take a step back, but it is so much better to like do this here, get agreement, make sure it's clear, fill in all the codes that you need, kind of be on the same page. It is so much better to do it now than later. It's very hard to be a third of the way through coding and like decide to add a code. Like that is so annoying. I've had to do it. It's really frustrating. So I know it seems probably like deflating to have to go through these introductory steps maybe a few times, but take my word for it that it's so much better to do it at the outset rather than try to sort of fix it and band-aid it later. So once you feel like the draft is really good and you have good inter-rater reliability and people agree, then you can begin coding like for real. And you know, just a couple things. So the first thing to decide is one person going to code each transcript, or is more than one person going to code each transcript, which is called double coding. Double coding is generally seen as sort of higher quality, less bias, because you've had two people independently make decisions about applying the codes. It obviously takes more time. It requires multiple team members to be engaged at that level. So, you know, sometimes that's not possible. But you should, even if you're just doing one coder per transcript, you would have had multiple team members participating in the development of the code book and inter-rater reliability testing. So you've had, you know, inputs from lots of people up until that point, which helps minimize whatever bias might have existed in kind of developing, designing, and applying the code book. So, you know, first decision is this, one coder or more than one. We said this, but I'll say it again, you know, you certainly get faster at coding as you do more of it, but it is really time consuming and really brain consuming. So it's important to be attentive and read carefully. So you really don't want to rush it. Give yourself plenty of time and brain decompression time when you're coding. Some tips for code books and coding. So code book development is hard, as Risa said, because you're kind of walking a tightrope. And these are a few of the ways that that shows up. So the first is like the codes you develop need to be broadly applicable. You don't want them to be so narrow that like you only use them once or twice. That's not very useful. So you want codes that you're going to be able to use a bunch of times across these transcripts, but they also need to be discrete. They have to have clear boundaries and they can't overlap with other codes, because if they overlap with other codes, then it's going to be very hard to reach agreement and be consistent about applying them. So they need to be like broad, but discrete, which is sometimes a very hard balance to strike. So that could sometimes take a while to sort of reach that balance. Also, codes can have direction, also called valence. And they should either, in a single code book, they should either all have valence or none should have valence. So examples of valence would be like positive or negative, or barrier or facilitator. So like, you know, let's say you're looking at something about like access to care and you're interested in wait times. How long do people wait for services? You can either have that just be like wait times, or you could have like wait time short, wait time long, or wait time barrier, wait time facilitator, right? So, but if you're going to do the valence, then like all your codes have to have valence. Then it has to be like transportation barrier, transportation facilitator, you know, travel time barrier, travel time facilitator. So this is a decision you make early on, is sort of, are the codes going to be sort of neutral, or are they going to have some directionality to them? And then the other kind of like tricky decision thing is this is one of those areas where there's really no consensus. There's just preference and experience. And these are not official terms, but they're terms that many of us use. So there are kind of two schools of thought in qualitative coding and analysis. You can either be a lumper or a splitter. So if you're a lumper, that means that you have pretty big codes, like, you know, on this broadly applicable and discrete, like they're pretty broad, which makes it much sort of easier to get to agreement during coding, and it makes the kind of upfront work go faster, but it probably requires more work later because you may have to kind of disaggregate and like get through it later and figure out what some concepts are within that code. So you might be a lumper or you might be a splitter. So splitters develop many more small codes, and that requires a lot more work up front because you have to specify them all, you have to refine them. Everyone has to be in agreement about where one stops and another one begins. So definitely requires more upfront work, but maybe easier later during analysis because they're very discrete. So this is like a really important decision to make early on your team, and different people may have different preferences. And so ultimately someone has to decide if the code book is going to sort of be a lumped or a split type of code book. There are pros and cons. Personally, I'm a lumper. Many other people are splitters. It's honestly, it's personal preference, but it's something to sort of work through and figure out how your team wants to tackle. I'm just going to show you examples and then I'll pause for questions. So this is NVivo. It's one of the various software options for coding qualitative data. Just kind of orient you to the screen. So in the middle here, you see the transcript that I'm in the process of coding. Unfortunately, in the screen capture, you can't see it, but the code book is there. It's all the way on the left-hand side that you can't see. But then you can see on the right, one nice thing about NVivo is it shows you, like, as you're applying the codes to the text, it puts these nice ribbons on that indicate which text has been applied for which code. So you can see that this text, like towards the upper third of the screen, that got coded as, this is an interview about cervical cancer. So cervical cancer risk factors, _ sex partners. So this person's talking about having sex with other women as a risk factor, so it got coded there, and also got coded as men's role risk factors. So we applied two codes in this case to the same text. You can do that if you feel like a segment of text kind of applies to more than one concept. And then towards the bottom, you see we applied this screening description code because we asked a question, can you explain how examining for cervical cancer works? And so that all got coded as screening description. So this is just one kind of type of software. This is what NVivo looks like. Most of the software options kind of look the same-ish with small differences. And this is generally conceptually how it works or how it looks. Okay. Before we get to analysis, I'm going to pause for a second and see if anyone has questions about code books, the software, anything like that.
I have one question about coding, which this has been super helpful. Like answered a lot of questions that we were actually discussing. Great. So you may have mentioned this, but you talk about like one person coding versus two people coding and iterator reliability. What about, and I don't know if you mentioned this, but two people coding at the same time and kind of like chatting back and forth on that? Where does that lie as like far as in between the two? So I would call that, I mean, you can definitely do that. It's sort of like coding by consensus. And I actually feel like that's becoming more popular. So a lot of the old software like NVivo and Atlas, they didn't allow any sharing. Well, they did, but it was really cumbersome and annoying to share files. And so basically everyone was sort of like in their own little coding universe. But now, like if you're using Deduce or other software, you can actually see other people's codes and it's much more collaborative. And I think now that I feel like the culture is moving a little bit more towards collaborative coding. So coding by consensus is definitely an option. I mean, obviously it could take a super long time because, you're sort of like discussing each row of this and how you think it should be coded. It's the kind of thing that you either, so you could do like the test run stuff. You could definitely do that coding by consensus.
And then you could do the rest the way I described. Or you could do the actual coding as coding by consensus. But if you're going to do that, it's like you have to do all of it as coding by consensus. Like you can't, like if you have 30 transcripts, you can't really do like 10 coding by consensus and like 10 one person does and 10 another person does. So I think it's fine if you're going to do it, but you need to consistently apply it as the method that you're doing sort of all of your coding as. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Sure. And if you are going to do coding by consensus, I still think that the test run and inter-rater reliability, whether you do the statistic or not, but just making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page about the code book and how it's applied, that's still important. And so you might do like a consensus approach for the test run, but the inter-rater reliability, like that should probably be an independent activity, because you need to make sure that like you both understand the code book the same way, right? So I think there's a benefit to having that be something that you kind of do with your blinders on, just to make sure that sort of everyone's on the same page before you proceed. Otherwise, that consensus process is going to take forever.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, I will move on to talking about analysis, but at the end, I'm happy to come back to any questions about coding or code books. So, I mean, analysis is really about interpreting the data. So identifying themes, comparing themes, really, again, like looking at those connections between the piles of flows. So the general steps are reading through the coded data. So like you have the pile of skirts and you kind of look at all the skirts, and then you look at like the pile of dresses, right? So you read through all the coded data, and your brain will start to naturally do this, but you'll document it as well. So you'll look for similarities, repetitions, clusters of codes or subcodes. And as you start to notice those, you'll start assigning meaning. You'll label the meaning of those, and those will be your themes that emerge, that sort of might cut across codes and might cut across categories of codes. And then as you identify those themes, you organize and you compare within or across themes in order to answer your research question. I know this sounds super abstract, so I'll show you an example in a couple of slides, but this is basically how analysis goes. And then writing and publishing. Oh, good. I do give a plug for this. So there are guidelines with recommendations for reporting qualitative data. There are multiple different ones. I have no horse in this race. I think, depending on which one you and your research team like is the one that you should use. They all have sort of strengths and weaknesses, but there are various guidelines, and many journals, when you submit a qualitative paper, will actually ask for you to submit the completed checklist that you adhere to the guidelines. So it's something to be aware of probably from the outset. I do a lot of qualitative work, but I do want to just put out there that there are some challenges in publishing qualitative work, and it's good to know that this exists, and to try to sort of think about it as you're planning the article and as you're planning your analysis. So the first is, a lot of biomedical journals have a really short word limit, and it's really hard to talk about qualitative data succinctly. So firstly, you may want to put quotes in your article, and those just eat up words, right? So there's just the quote problem. Then describing the methods, describing the analysis, describing the themes, all of that is word-based. In quantitative analysis, you can get away with shorthand for a lot of stuff. You could say we did a chi-square test, and the reader knows what a chi-square test is. But in qualitative, you really have to unpack the details of everything that you did. And so qualitative papers, it is hard to write short qualitative papers. So sometimes there's a word limit problem. Also, not all journals, especially in the biomedical space, are interested in qualitative research. There has long been a bias against qualitative research in both medicine and public health. And some journals, this is just not their jam, and they very rarely publish qual work. And if that's the case, you have to look for a journal that is interested in this method, finds it valid, and is willing to publish it. So there's some sort of journal selectivity. Related to that, not all reviewers are qualified to review qualitative research. And I have received many infuriating reviews from non-qualitative researchers who are critiquing qualitative work. And so, you know, finding journals that publish qualitative work, hopefully they have a reviewer pool that's equipped to critique a qualitative manuscript, but not always. So that can be an added challenge. And related to that, there's a lot of tension about the degree to which you quantify your findings. So like, you know, I told you at the beginning that the point of qualitative analysis is not to say how much or how many, but it's to talk about meaning. However, many reviewers and readers want to know the predominance of those meanings. So if you identify a theme, is that something that like everybody said? Is it something that most people who you interviewed said, or some people, or just a few people? And are those adjectives enough, or do they want like actual numbers, you know, 2/3 of our respondents expressed, et cetera? So there's a lot of tension about sort of how much you quantify your qualitative findings. I have personal opinions about this, which I'm happy to talk about, but, you know, I think especially if you're working with a mentor right now, they may also have preference, and journals have preferences. So I think just sort of be aware of the fact that there is some tension about putting numbers and how much you do that for qualitative results. So I'm going to show you just a couple of examples of different levels of like complexity of some recent qualitative work. So this is actually a project that an STTP student did 2 summers ago in Malawi. Sam Lewis worked on this project. I had previously done some qualitative work with women, indicating that their husbands could be both a barrier, but sometimes a facilitator for them to get screened for cervical cancer. So that there seemed to be this interesting thing happening in the spousal relationship around cervical cancer screening. And so we decided to talk to men and do qualitative work with men in Malawi to understand their opinions, knowledge, impressions related to cervical cancer. This was a mixed method study. So we collected quantitative data and qualitative data. The paper actually came out relatively recently. There's a screenshot if you want to go track it down and read it. It was very cool. And actually the screen I showed you of what in vivo looks like, that was one of the transcripts from this study. So we had a survey where we asked various things of these men. And then we had a short but very meaningful qualitative section at the end where we really only asked 3 very specific questions and then an open-ended question about the role of men in cervical cancer prevention. So short qualitative piece and a bunch of quantitative piece. And the analysis really aimed to bring these together in a mixed methods way. I thought you might like to see what the codebook looked like. And we actually developed this one inductively. There was not a very good pre-existing framework for us to work on. And so we developed this codebook from the data. So it happens, I do it sometimes, not often, but here you can see this is what our codebook looked like. There are the code names, the definition of that code, and some example quotes. And you can see that we differentiated between like screening hypothetically painful versus like screening experience painful, right? So like really, you know, we tried to be as specific as we could in this code book, but it went through many iterations. This was a long process to sort of inductively design this code book. So here was an example of kind of identifying themes within codes. So as I mentioned, I'm a lumper. And so we had some really like broad codes. And so one was impressions about male doctors. That was the code, impressions, male doctor. And so when we finished coding, I like extracted all the stuff that we had coded as impressions male doctor. And I started to look for like things within here that were coming up. And so on the left-hand side, you can see, so I started to notice some stuff about being uncomfortable, and that within that fell into a few categories. So there were some men who were worried that doctors would develop sexual feelings towards their wives, some who just had like a shyness and modesty problem. And then there were some guys who said it wasn't a problem, and there's sort of reasons why. And so, you know, if I had been a splitter, we could have tried to like articulate all of these codes up front and had them in the code book. It would have been hard because we were doing this inductively, but we could have tried. Instead, since I'm a lumper, we sort of had to do this during the analysis stage. So, you know, this was sort of step 1, was sort of looking for these categories and kind of themes within the codes. And then we started to look, you know, we compared those by the men's characteristics. So we looked for like if older or younger men said these things more than others, or if the man's wife had been screened or not, was he more likely to be uncomfortable or comfortable? Not quantifying it, but just looking to see kind of how common these sentiments were among different types of men. So that's sort of, this was like not a very elaborate qualitative analysis, but it gives you an idea of sort of one way that you might tackle it. The second example, so sorry, this is past tense because I was going to talk to you guys a few weeks ago, but now you heard Kumbo a few weeks ago give a lecture about her master's thesis. And this was an article we actually wrote based on her master's thesis data that she talked to you about. So she did interviews with 30 HIV positive Malawian adults who were also hypertensive. And her interview guide had questions about care seeking, which we did not look at in this paper, and then about health behaviors, which was the focus of this paper. So this was like a much richer qualitative data set. These were longer interviews. It wasn't just 3 questions like it was in the other paper. So we had a lot more to kind of work with. And we found these main themes, which I'm not going to sort of detail right now, but these were kind of high level themes that sort of corresponded with our codes, more or less. They were pretty close to what our code book looked like. But then we noticed some kind of connecting, like meta themes that cut across those topics. So for example, we found this relationship between hypertension and household finances, and that seemed to exist especially for women. And that showed up in a bunch of our different sort of codes, a bunch of the different themes that I showed you on that previous page. So there was an aspect about financial strain, then a connection with adherence and being able to buy food, and that there was something going on with sort of household structures and dependence and that kind of thing. So this sort of more like overarching theme that we discovered. And then another overarching theme about the intersection between gender roles and health behaviors. And this again cut across the codes and themes on the previous slide. But again, it was really sort of connecting and looking, this is sort of like the connective tissue between everything else. So we found that wives were more likely to accommodate their husband's dietary needs, but the reverse wasn't happening, and that women were really changing their social relationships in response to being hypertensive and men were not. And so we sort of found this like gender role thing that was really interesting. So, you know, with richer qualitative data, you can do like, you know, it's no longer just those piles of clothes, but you can really start to see the connections and the ties between things that you might not otherwise see as readily with sort of more surface level data. Yeah, so I see Joy's comment. I'm being a little sloppy with my use of concepts and themes. I'm using concepts. Yeah, I guess the way I'm using it is like concepts are like meta themes and themes are within those. But this is sort of sloppy on my part. So there's codes. Codes can be grouped into categories, and themes are looking either within codes and within categories or across codes and across categories. So to me, like concepts and themes are almost synonymous.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, and then last slide, just to show you a bunch of resources. So some of these are, I forget if all of these were on the earlier slides about qual data collection, but a lot of the qual resources also include information about designing code books and doing analysis and doing mixed methods analysis and what that looks like. So I just wanted to share a bunch of those again, as some of you are undertaking coding and all of that, these might be particularly useful for you. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy in the last couple of minutes just to answer any questions. And if people have other questions, you know, always feel free to send me an email. It's so fun, but so much work, but so fun. Any questions from the group?
I just want to say it was super helpful. I really appreciate it. It was like, it makes things a lot clearer. It's still confusing, but it's less confusing than it was.
Yeah, and I think one of the tricky things about qual, you know, something you said up front, and I said a few times, is like people have a lot of preferences and there's lots of differences in how people do things. And every time I start with a new qual team, I have to kind of recalibrate and I maybe wouldn't use the word confusing, but like there is sort of like a learning curve every time with the team you're working with and how you're going to do stuff. So, you know, to some extent, hopefully some of the confusion will abate over time. But if you keep doing qualitative work, you know, it's not as easy as like writing code and Stata and pressing go. Like it's always a bit of a kind of learning and adjusting every time you get new data, every time you have a new team. So that's part of the fun, but it is part of what makes it challenging and time consuming and why the method sections are so long and all of that.
I just have a question about publications. So I have a qual study that is with a journal. It's been there since the end of April with no, you know, nothing and no communication. And I'm just wondering if it tends to take a little bit longer to get it reviewed when it's qualitative, maybe because of the fact that there aren't as many people that do it, or if it doesn't really matter.
Maybe, although review times right now are terrible. We actually just got an R&R on something we submitted in October. Jenna, one of Jenna's papers, another SCTP student. So, I mean, right now, just review timelines are like bonkers long.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it might take a little bit longer because there is a smaller reviewer pool. It depends on the journal. I think if you submit to a journal that has a really robust qual reviewer pool, it shouldn't be that bad. If you submit to like the Lancet that really doesn't publish that many qual paper, I mean, they may just reject it, you know, desk reject outright, but yeah, it might take them a little longer to find people who are willing to do it and sort of submit high quality reviews. So it might be, but honestly, Tracy, April till now is not bad. I mean, you can like hassle the editor, but
yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily in a huge rush, but your presentation made me like think like, yeah, I need to check in and see what's going on with that.
Yeah. And you can also, I mean, we'll talk about this next week, but you can suggest reviewers to the editor, you know, other qualitative. Okay, good.
I actually was very precise, in fact. Yeah. So we'll